Joining us right now via phone is Dr. Paul Kengor. He is a poli-sci professor at Grove City College, and he is the author of several books, but the one I want to talk about today is The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March of Death, Deception, and Infiltration. Dr. Paul Kengor, thank you for being on our program.
Yeah, Joe, it's good to be with you. Thanks.
You know, as you well know, as you've said probably many times now, it's hard not to look at the headlines and realize the sort of the state of the affairs, that the trouble we're in. We live in a day and an age where people openly embrace, they're not secret about it anymore, they openly embrace or espouse socialism and even communism, and one has to wonder, do they have any idea what they're thinking or saying? And this book, I've gone through the audio book. I'm probably just about 75% into it at this point, and I have the printed copy or the digital version in front of me as well. And this is a hammer blow to anybody who would espouse socialism, communism. And so I'm very excited to have you on our program. And I want to start with Karl Marx.
Thank you. Yeah.
I want to start with Karl Marx. I know he's only about a third of your book in actuality. However, I think it's the most important part of the entire book, in the sense that revisionist history is a thing, and getting to know who this person really is super important. Can you start there? Tell us, who is Karl Marx?
Sure. Yeah, and I haven't listened to the audio yet myself, so you're doing better than me. That's
it's very good.
That's impressive. And I've got to say, you're right. If people only knew, I mean, I think maybe you wanted to ask this to me later. I shouldn't jump ahead, but somebody like Patrisse Cullors, who's the president of Black Lives Matter, and she's an avowed Marxist. She's very open about it. Read Lenin, Marx, and Mao, and if she only knew, among other things, not just what a diabolical ideology this is that Marx crafted here, but that Marx was an awful person and an awful racist, for that matter. I mean, and this is stuff that people don't know, and including so many Catholics raised in our modern Catholic education, Catholic schools. Catholics a few generations ago did know about it. I mean, they did know about the evils of communism. So the failure to know this stuff, and I commend you for talking about this, explains where we are now. And you're right. If people that don't know this, if they actually pause and open the book and look at it, it will be a hammer blow. And I've had people, including a lot of people that are listening right now, they're going to follow up and probably send me an email on this, who say, you know, I read this, and my kid in college or 20-something really needs to read this, but I just don't think that she or he will, right? You know, how do I even get them to read it? And the point is, play upon what they've been taught in their secular universities about diversity and freedom of thought and tolerance. If they're really open-minded, if they're really tolerant, if they really believe in diversity, then they'll open and read a book that they might think they might not agree with, right? So, yeah, sorry, that's a little bit of a long digression. And so to start with the person of Marx, boy, he was born in Trier, Germany, May 5th, 1818, so a little over 200 years ago. And I'll just start with this, Joe, and then cut me off and jump in at any point. But Trier is one of the most Catholic cities in all of Germany. And in fact, you'd probably put in the top three. It was the original cathedral in Trier was founded around the year 330 by none other than Saint Helena, the mother to Augustine, of all people. And when Helena went to the Holy Land to make her famous pilgrimage, where she came back with, among other things, she believed the true cross, pieces of the true cross. She came back with the crown of thorns that's in Notre Dame today. She also came back with what she believed was the holy robe, the holy coat that Jesus wore on the way to his crucifixion, that the Roman soldiers cast lots for at the foot of the cross. That robe is in that cathedral in Trier. That's the town where Marx grew up. So Marx grew up quite literally in the shadow of that great cathedral. And as you probably noticed, one of the quite literally, diabolical plays that Marx wrote. He wrote often. He wrote a number of poems, plays even, about evil, about the devil. In one of them, he has this devil character who's sawing on this violin and working himself up to this frenzy of flames. The guy, when he's wearing this, Marx not only wrote the play, the script, he also wrote the stage for it. He wrote the costumes, everything. While this player, this violinist, is playing this kind of devilish music, he's wearing the holy robe of Jesus. Yeah, he's wearing the holy robe of Jesus. And I opened the book with two different stanzas from two different plays or poems of Marx. And the player, that's the one where he says, "See this sword, the prince of darkness sold it to me. It stabs unerringly within thy soul till the hellish vapors rise and fill the brain, till my heart goes mad and I go utterly insane. I play ever boldly, I play to the dance of death." So that comes from that play. So Marx had this weird, sick fascination with the devil. I say very carefully in the book that I am not of the authority as a secular person or as a historian to level a charge like, oh, Marx was possessed.
Yeah, I picked up on that early. Obviously, you make this clause here. It's like, this is the default statement. I have to read this. I got to make sure everybody understands I'm not declaring him possessed. Okay, now we can move on. He is potentially very possessed.
Yeah, I like how it's the devil and Karl Marx and not the devil in Karl Marx.
Right.
So, very good.
Well, and I should point out, I quote there some scholars, biographers of Marx, who feel that he was possessed. And one of them is the late pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who was literally tortured in communist prison camps in Romania. And he had communist torturers quite literally shouting at him, "We are the devil. We are the devil."
Wow.
So he believed that Marx was, I think he said, a Satanist. And now he'll be dismissed by a lot of secular historians. I quote one of them, Francis Wien, who's very pro-Marx and makes fun of Wurmbrand for it. And I note in the book in a footnote, I'm like, that's really kind of rude and crude to do that, Mr. Wien, because after all, you weren't tortured in communist prisons like Wurmbrand was, right? Cut the guy some slack. And the other person who's really a scholar and true authority on Marx was a British scholar named Robert Payne, who was a British man of arts, letters, playwright, literature, a really eclectic, very well-rounded, absolutely not what anyone would consider a right-winger. Wrote a couple of major biographies of Marx, 1968, early 70s. And he said there did seem times in which Marx believed he was doing the works of the devil. And he said where it seemed like Marx might have been possessed. So others have said that, but I always want to be very careful, especially as a Catholic, right? Faith, hope, and charity. We want to be charitable. You don't ever want to level a charge at somebody like that if you don't know, right? But as I say in the book, whether or not the guy was a Satanist or possessed, and he was an atheist, so he didn't believe in the spiritual, we should all at least agree that what we see here from Marx is very troubling, and certainly not somebody whose philosophy and ideology one would want to emulate.
Did you happen to read any of Fulton Sheen's books on communism or any of his speeches on communism? Did he talk about this kind of thing?
Every book. I read every book that Sheen did on communism and the conscience of the West, even books that almost pamphlets, smaller books. Communism answers the questions of a communist. That's one that hardly anyone even knows about.
I haven't heard
that. Yeah. And so Sheen knew this. He knew a lot of it. He especially knew the personal stuff on Marx. And if you look in the endnotes, I quote Sheen. I quote the conservative British historian Paul Johnson. I quote Wurmbrand. But most of all, wherever I can, I quote the original primary sources, Marx himself, and also sympathetic Marxist historians, to the extent that they cover this stuff. Most of the modern day Marxist historians avoid this stuff like the plague. But the original Marx plays, the really chilling ones, they were discovered by Marx's original biographer, a German socialist named Franz Mehring, who, when he discovered this stuff, he told Marx's daughter, he said, you do not want people to see this, right? This stuff, put this under lock and key. I mean, this is really bad, right? So for anybody listening now who's maybe a Marxist who wants to shrug this off, Marx's original historian didn't shrug it off. I mean, he knew how ugly this was. He knew how disturbing it was. And it was left to a communist, the Bolshevik, David Ryazanov of the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow, to find this stuff almost 40, 50 years later, and at least had the intellectual integrity to say, no, this needs to be preserved. This needs to be kept. This is the real Karl Marx, and this should not be suppressed. This information needs to be known.
Dr. Paul Kengor is our guest. His book is The Devil and Karl Marx. It is published by Tan, by the way, and we will link to it, of course. It is a great book. I highly recommend it. It is intense in parts, actually, a hammer blow to this modern revisionist ideal of a utopia that we can somehow all achieve is now out and out in the public sphere. It's a very concerning. I want to go back to Marx and you made the mention you can't really say one way or the other he was possessed, but the evidence does show incredible disturbance in this person. He was born Jewish. His father converted to Protestantism, grew up in the most Catholic town in Germany. But this guy, he was not a happy person. He was a disturbed individual, angry. His family life was horrible. I mean, tell me about some of those types of details. I mean, two of his daughters, I learned from your book, committed suicide in a suicide pact. This is disturbing information. This is not a person who is peaceful himself, let alone could present to us how to achieve utopia.
That's right. Yeah. So two daughters. I mean, as a historian, I don't know of another case of this ever. He had two daughters who committed suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands. Okay, and one of the husbands ended up backing out on the suicide pact after he gave his wife, Marx's daughter, poison. And this guy, Edward Aveling, was just an awful guy. In fact, he was a lot like Marx, very selfish, philanderer, socialist, mooched money off of everybody else, never made any money himself. And people believed that he should have been, friends of the Marx children in the community believed that he probably should have been tried for murder in that case. But in fact, he gave her poison. And as you probably saw too, Joe, in some of Marx's poetry, diabolical poetry about the devil, including the one, The Pale Maiden, which sounds like a late night B-movie horror flick. If you read this thing, the Pale Maiden commits suicide by ingesting poison. So so this kind of stuff Marx talked about, he wrote about. In fact, the family members even talked about how their dad used to scare them by telling them about these awful stories. One of them, Hans Rokel, who was this little German craftsman magician who made these little figurines. They said another, in fact, a whole bunch of people around Marx said this, his favorite line, his favorite quote from anything. I mean, pause right here, Joe, if they ask me or you, right? Hey, do you have a favorite quote, favorite verse? You might say, oh, yeah, Old Testament, New Testament, 1 Corinthians, whatever. Quote from a saint, right? Be not afraid. For Marx, it was a quote from Goethe's Faust. Wow. And Faust, the Faustian bargain, and specifically from the character Mephistopheles, the devil, demon character. And that favorite line was, everything that exists deserves to perish, right? Everything that exists deserves to perish. So these people who say, oh, why are you guys so hard on Marx? It's just this little old German guy in a library who just was talking about people sharing wealth and about how bad factory conditions had become. No, Marx wanted to burn down the house. Yeah. Everything that exists deserves to perish. He had few to no friends. He lost almost all of his friends. He even almost lost Engels, who got so sick of Marx getting money from him all the time. And he almost lost the only person he truly loved. Well, I would say he did love his kids. He almost lost his wife Jenny when he got the family nursemaid Lenchen pregnant behind Jenny's back. Yeah, and then of course it refused to acknowledge that the child was his. Refused to pay the child a penny of child support. He refused to pay Lenchen. Wow. Lenchen was lent to the family on loan by Jenny's family. She had grown up with Jenny as like a sister. And Jenny's family said, we can't give you guys any more money. This is just wrong. This is wrong. Karl must make money. But both Karl's mom and wife said they wish that Karl would start earning capital rather than just writing about capital. So they lent Jenny, or they lent Lenchen to the Marx family. Marx refused to pay her any money, and then got her pregnant. Robert Payne says that he thinks it's quite possible that Marx may have raped her, but wow. I don't know of anybody else who has said that. I have no idea if that's true, but at the least, this champion of the proletariat, right, didn't pay her a dime, and when his wife wasn't looking, pinned Lenchen down and had sex with her and got her pregnant.
That's terrible.
What about Engels? We haven't heard anything about him. Is he just a sidekick? I never hear anything about him in general. It's always a focus on Marx. Why is that, and what can you tell us about Engels?
Yeah, and Engels described Marx when he first saw him as the monster of 10,000 devils.
Wow.
Right? Imagine that. And Engels is kind of a much more sympathetic case. So he was a Christian. He was raised a Christian, and he struggled. He struggled with the faith. There's some really touching diary entries and written statements from him where he's struggling to be a good boy, struggling to be faithful. And his father, who was a capitalist businessman, at one point sent Engels off to England to try to get him away from all these German socialists who were corrupting him. And he talked about being pulled in by this black man from Trier, right? This dark figure from Trier. That's Marx. He means black here in the sense of like dark, foreboding. So Engels got pulled in. He ended up becoming Marx's sidekick. And probably the only reason Marx didn't insult him and call him every name in the book was he needed Marx, or he needed Engels, in order to keep Marx and his family a roof over their heads, and in order for Marx to have money. So Marx could sit around all day on his carbuncles and boils and write. But he did almost lose Engels as a friend when Engels' live-in girlfriend, Engels, like so many of these early communists, and this would be a separate conversation, did not believe in marriage. So he refused to marry these poor women. And when one of them died unexpectedly, he was just crushed by it. And Marx wrote him a letter about 4 pages long. In the first few sentences, opening paragraph, acknowledging Engels' loss, and then the more important issue of asking him for money. Right?
Oh, that's rough.
And Engels was so angry about this that he wrote back this just irate letter. More sympathy than you.
Can you repeat that line? Because you just broke up. You broke up. Can you repeat that line?
Engels wrote back saying to Marx, even my capitalist friends showed more sympathy than you.
Ouch.
Right?
Wow. That's pretty rough.
And there's not an ounce of compassion from you. So he almost cut him off at that point, but he didn't. He hung in there, and Engels stayed with the Marx family long enough to take care of all of them, give the eulogies at Marx and Marx's wife's funerals, where he quoted Darwin, and that was Engels is a sad case. He really is.
Now, was Engels Catholic and left the faith, or was he Protestant and left the faith?
Neither one of them were, and neither one of them was Catholic. And Marx's father, so he came from a long line of he was Jewish, and there were a number of rabbis in the family. And in fact, I was talking to my good friend Michael Medved about this, and Michael's an Orthodox Jew,